November 19, 1941, the western desert of Libya. A British reconnaissance patrol was observing Italian positions through binoculars when the commander spotted something that made him chuckle. Italian soldiers were moving across the desert floor in a peculiar formation, and they were wearing helmets adorned with large black feathers that waved absurdly in the wind. Even more bizarre, they weren't walking or marching. They were running. Every single one of them was running at a steady jog, even while carrying full combat equipment. The British officer turned to his sergeant and made a comment that would later appear in his unit diary. He called it the most theatrical display of military pageantry he had ever witnessed in a combat zone. His men were still laughing when the first mortar rounds started falling on their position with devastating accuracy. What that British patrol had encountered was the Bersaglieri, and their condescending amusement was about to be replaced by something very different. Within the next 72 hours, those theatrical Italian soldiers would inflict over 300 casualties on British forces and capture an entire supply depot that Allied planners had considered safely behind the lines. But here's what makes this story remarkable. The laughter of that British officer wasn't unusual. It was the standard Allied attitude toward Italian soldiers throughout World War II. The Desert War had conditioned British and American troops to view Italians as reluctant soldiers who would surrender at the first opportunity. Rommel's Afrika Korps got all the respect. The Italians were considered barely more than a nuisance. That assumption was about to be proven fatally wrong, and the soldiers who would destroy it wore feathers on their helmets and ran everywhere they went. Let me show you who the Bersaglieri actually were, because their history explains everything about why they fought the way they did. The Bersaglieri were created in 1836 by General Alessandro La Marmora of the Kingdom of Sardinia. But they weren't created as regular infantry. They were designed from the ground up to be something different. Elite light infantry, trained for speed, marksmanship, and independent action. While the rest of the army marched in formation, the Bersaglieri were expected to move fast, hit hard, and disappear before the enemy could respond. The running wasn't pageantry. It was doctrine. Every Bersaglieri soldier was required to run everywhere, in training and in combat. Not a sprint that would exhaust them, but a steady jog of about 180 steps per minute that they could maintain for hours. The purpose was tactical. A unit that could cover ground at twice the speed of regular infantry could exploit gaps in enemy lines, respond to threats faster, and retreat before being pinned down. And the feathers? Those had a different purpose entirely. The black capercaillie feathers on their distinctive plumed helmets served as identification. In the chaos of 19th century battlefields filled with black powder smoke, commanders needed to know where their elite units were. The feathers waving above the smoke made the Bersaglieri visible to their own officers while also serving as a psychological weapon. Enemies would see the feathers coming and know exactly what kind of fighters they were about to face. By the time World War II began, the Bersaglieri had 105 years of combat tradition behind them. They had fought in every major Italian conflict, including World War I, where they suffered catastrophic casualties in the Alpine fighting against Austria-Hungary. But that suffering had forged them into something harder than the regular Italian army. Here's what the British didn't understand. The regular Italian infantry of World War II was indeed often poorly led, poorly equipped, and poorly motivated. Many Italian conscripts had no idea why they were fighting in North Africa and had no desire to die for Mussolini's imperial ambitions. But the Bersaglieri weren't conscripts. They were volunteers who had to pass rigorous physical and mental tests to join. They considered themselves the elite of the Italian military, and they had the training to back up that belief. Now let me take you to North Africa, where the Bersaglieri would prove exactly what they were capable of. The Desert War of 1940-1943 was marked by wild swings of fortune. Armies would advance hundreds of miles, then retreat just as far. Supply lines were constantly stretched, and small unit actions often decided larger battles. It was exactly the kind of warfare the Bersaglieri were designed for. In December 1940, the British launched Operation Compass, a counter-offensive against Italian forces that had invaded Egypt. What followed was one of the most lopsided victories in military history. Over 130,000 Italian soldiers were captured. Entire divisions surrendered without firing a shot. British casualty figures were almost embarrassingly low. But buried in the after-action reports was a series of footnotes that told a different story. Certain Italian units had fought with unexpected ferocity. They had inflicted disproportionate casualties. They had delayed British advances for hours or even days. And almost every one of those footnotes mentioned the same thing. The unit in question was Bersaglieri. At the siege of Bardia in January 1941, the 1st Bersaglieri Regiment held their sector for 48 hours after the rest of the Italian garrison had collapsed. Australian troops attacking their positions reported that the Italians fought like demons and had to be dug out of their foxholes one by one. When the position finally fell, the Australian commander counted over 400 enemy dead in front of the Bersaglieri lines. The Bersaglieri had not retreated. They had not surrendered. They had died in place. But it was Operation Crusader, the British offensive of November 1941, where the Bersaglieri would truly announce themselves to the Allied armies. The battle began on November 18, 1941. British and Commonwealth forces launched a massive attack aimed at relieving the besieged garrison at Tobruk and destroying Rommel's Afrika Korps. What they encountered was a German-Italian defense that was far more resilient than expected. The 8th Bersaglieri Regiment was positioned near the Sidi Rezegh airfield, a critical piece of terrain that both sides needed to control. On November 21st, a British armored brigade attacked their positions, expecting the Italians to break as so many had before. They didn't break. Here's what the British encountered. Instead of static defensive positions, the Bersaglieri used their mobility to constantly shift their firing lines. Anti-tank gunners would engage British tanks, then pick up their weapons and run to new positions before the tanks could return fire. Machine gun teams would suppress British infantry, then relocate before artillery could find them. The British Armored Brigade commander later wrote that fighting the Bersaglieri was like fighting ghosts who were always somewhere else. The battle for Sidi Rezegh lasted 5 days. The Bersaglieri, outnumbered and outgunned, held their positions against repeated attacks. When they finally withdrew, it was on their own terms, in good order, carrying their wounded with them. British casualties in the sector exceeded 1,200 men. The Bersaglieri had lost 347, but what happened at point 175 would become legend even among their enemies. On November 23, 1941, a Bersaglieri battalion was ordered to assault a British-held hill designated point 175. The position was defended by a full battalion of South African infantry supported by artillery. A frontal assault against prepared positions was textbook suicide. The Bersaglieri didn't make a frontal assault. Moving at night, running in their distinctive style even in darkness, they circled around the British position. At dawn on November 24th, they attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. The South Africans, who had been expecting an assault from the front, were caught completely off guard. Within 2 hours, point 175 had fallen. The Bersaglieri captured the entire position, including over 200 prisoners and a significant cache of supplies. A captured South African officer later gave a statement that was included in British intelligence reports. He said he had never seen infantry move so fast under fire. He said his men had been shooting at soldiers who seemed to dodge between the bullets. He said the feathers on their helmets had been the last thing he saw before his position was overrun. The reputation of the Bersaglieri spread through the British 8th Army. General Neil Ritchie, commanding the British forces, issued a specific intelligence bulletin, warning his officers about Italian units wearing plumed helmets. The bulletin noted that these units should be treated as equivalent to German troops in terms of fighting capability, but the Bersaglieri's most remarkable performance was yet to come, during the retreat from El Alamein. October 1942. General Bernard Montgomery had just launched his offensive at El Alamein, the battle that would turn the tide of the North African campaign. Rommel's forces were being pushed back. The Italian infantry, as expected, was collapsing. Thousands were surrendering. The rout seemed complete, but the Bersaglieri were doing something different. They were running, not away from the enemy, but across the battlefield, conducting one of the most effective fighting withdrawals of the entire war. The 7th Bersaglieri Regiment was tasked with covering the retreat of the entire Italian-German southern flank. For 12 days, from October 23rd to November 4th, they fought a continuous rearguard action. Every time British forces threatened to encircle the retreating Axis troops, the Bersaglieri would appear, attack, inflict casualties, and then disappear into the desert before the British could respond. Montgomery himself mentioned the Bersaglieri in his post-battle report. He noted that certain Italian units had displayed a martial spirit and tactical competence that demanded respect. Coming from Montgomery, who rarely had anything positive to say about Italian soldiers, this was extraordinary praise. By the end of the North African campaign, the Bersaglieri had earned a reputation that would outlive the war itself. British veterans who had fought in the desert would later distinguish between Italians and Bersaglieri, as if they were two different nationalities. The soldiers with the feathers, they would say, were different. But here's what makes this story significant beyond the tactical details. The Bersaglieri exposed a fundamental flaw in how the Allies thought about their enemies. The assumption that all Italian soldiers were poorly motivated and quick to surrender was based on experience, but it was also based on stereotype. That assumption led British commanders to underestimate certain units to their cost. It led to tactical plans that didn't account for Italian competence, and it led to casualties that might have been avoided if Allied intelligence had been more nuanced in its assessments. The Bersaglieri didn't change the outcome of the war. Italy still lost, but they proved something that military historians have wrestled with ever since. National armies are not monolithic. Elite units within a struggling military can perform at levels that shock their enemies. And traditions that seem absurd from the outside, like running everywhere and wearing feathers into combat, can have real tactical value when backed by proper training and genuine motivation. Today, the Bersaglieri still exist as part of the modern Italian army. They still wear their plumed helmets on parade. They still run. And in barracks throughout Italy, they still tell stories of the Desert War, when they made the British stop laughing and start paying attention. Here's my question for you. The Allied assumption about Italian soldiers was based on real experience, but it blinded them to exceptions like the Bersaglieri. How often do you think military commanders make the same mistake today, judging entire armies by their worst units while ignoring their best? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this changed how you see the Italian military in World War II, hit that like button and subscribe for more history that challenges what you thought you knew. Thanks for watching.